Welcome to another episode of 8 Digital Podcast. Israel and Iran entered into a shaky ceasefire Tuesday morning, bringing an uncertain end to 12 days of fighting that had sparked fears of regional war. The ceasefire appeared to be in trouble within hours of both sides acknowledging its start, as Israel said Tehran fired another wave of missiles sounding sirens across northern Israel, and Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said he instructed the military to respond forcefully to Iran's violation of the ceasefire. A message posted on the Telegram channel of Iran's state broadcaster denied the claim of a missile launch. The ceasefire proposal was first announced by President Donald Trump on Monday evening, and both sides appeared to have accepted a cessation in fighting Tuesday morning after a final onslaught of attacks overnight. Wow, that opening really sets a very intense stage, doesn't it?
It really does. Shaky is probably the right word.
Yeah. So today, we're going to take a closer look at these recent, pretty dramatic events, particularly the strategic actions targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, right in the middle of this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems pretty clear that a major driving force here is Israel's long-standing apprehension about Iran's nuclear program.
Absolutely. That's been a core concern for decades.
So we want to explore what these developments mean for the region and, importantly, what they mean for you, the listener, as things shift on the global stage.
It's definitely a complex picture. Every action, every reaction, it has layers of meaning and potential consequences.
Right.
Understanding these specific moves from, all sides. It isn't just about reporting the news cycle. It gives you vital insight into the geopolitical landscape right now.
Okay.
What we're watching unfold really offers a window into the strategies, maybe the vulnerabilities, too, of the key players there in the Middle East, and how those dynamics could shape things for years to come.
Okay, so let's start with what many people are calling sort of the pivotal moment here.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. military operation targeting those 3 Iranian nuclear sites, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan.
Yes, that was a major escalation.
President Trump, he didn't mince words, did he? He called the strikes a spectacular military success and basically said Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
Obliterated. That's very strong language.
It is. So what exactly was the U.S. aiming for with such a, decisive move?
Well, from the U.S. standpoint, this wasn't just another military strike. It was seen as an attempt to fundamentally reset one of its most persistent foreign policy headaches.
The Iranian nuclear program.
Exactly. For years, experts have been warning that Iran's dash time, that's the critical window to get enough weapons-grade stuff for a bomb, had shrunk to maybe just 2 to 5 days, terrifyingly short.
Oh, 2 to 5 days.
Yeah. And the belief in Washington was essentially that only the United States had the specific firepower the bunker busters needed to really destroy Iran's deeply buried, hardened nuclear sites, like Fordow, built into a mountain. So many there saw this as a potential game changer. Some were even calling it perhaps the biggest U.S. foreign policy win since the Cold War ended. The goal was to decisively roll back that nuclear threat that's lingered for so long and, crucially, address Israel's really deep-seated concerns.
And it definitely had immediate, undeniable implications.
Yeah.
These strikes were seen right away as stripping Tehran of any nuclear leverage, at least for a while. A complete strategic shift, seemingly.
It seems so. The International Atomic Energy Agency head, Rafael Grossi, he confirmed pretty quickly that the Fordow plant probably sustained very significant damage.
Okay.
He also mentioned damage to buildings used for uranium conversion, tunnel entrances at the Isfahan site, places crucial for storing enriched material. And of course, Natanz was hit too.
So the message was clear.
Very clear. Iran's path to a weapon, assuming that was their definite intent, just got a whole lot longer, a lot more complicated.
But, despite the scale of these attacks, there were these whispers, these suggestions that maybe Iran saw some of it coming. Reports that they might have moved materials, equipment, maybe from Fordow to, undisclosed locations beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
If that's true, it suggests maybe a calculated move, not a complete surprise, right?
It absolutely does suggest that. If Iran did manage to move sensitive stuff, it means they weren't caught completely off guard.
Right.
It points to a certain level of foresight. Maybe based on intelligence, maybe just reading the strategic tea leaves. It could also imply they had a contingency plan, to rebuild or continue parts of the program more covertly. It's a really dangerous game of cat and mouse, isn't it? Both sides trying to guess the other's next move.
Definitely. So, okay, their nuclear infrastructure takes this massive hit. The immediate question wasn't if Iran would respond, but really how. What was Tehran's play after that?
Well, Iran responded with a ballistic missile attack. They targeted the U.S. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which is, a huge deal. It's the biggest U.S. military base in the Middle East.
Right, Al Udeid is massive.
But here's the thing. This wasn't really a devastating blow. It seemed highly symbolic, very carefully calibrated. They launched, 14 missiles, but 13 were intercepted. And one, apparently quite deliberately, was set free, aimed at a non-threatening area.
So no casualties, no damage.
No casualties, no significant damage reported. And what's really interesting is that the U.S. apparently got advance warning. Satellite pictures showed aircraft had been moved off the tarmac at Al Udeid before the missiles hit.
Ah, okay, so Iran warns them, essentially.
It certainly looks like it, or at least allows a warning to get through. It suggests Iran was performing this high-stakes balancing act, like deterrence by non-escalation, trying to save face, show they can hit back, reestablish deterrence, but without triggering the all-out war nobody really wanted, a very dangerous tightrope walk.
It is a delicate dance, yeah, sending a strong message without crossing that ultimate red line.
Mm-hmm.
And after these strikes, Iran's public stance on its nuclear program seemed to, adjust a bit.
Right.
Their deputy foreign minister, Majid Takhtravanchi, he stated Iran would stay in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, even though they'd threatened to pull out before.
Right.
Is that a real policy shift, do you think? Or just another tactical move?
That decision, I think, points to some really deep internal dynamics going on inside the Iranian regime, very top.
And it looks like Iran was also scrambling for outside help. Their foreign minister, Arachi, met with Putin in Russia, reportedly asking for more help.
Yes.
But then we hear reports that Iran wasn't happy with Russia's level of support. What does that tell us about their alliances right now?
Well, it highlights, I think, Iran's sort of growing isolation, maybe?
Yeah.
And the limits of its partnerships. Russia's been a key ally, sure, especially in Syria, helping push back against Western sanctions. But their support isn't a blank check.
Right. Russia has its own interests.
Exactly. Russia has its own strategic priorities. Getting dragged into a direct military fight with the U.S. for Iran, especially while bogged down in Ukraine, that's probably not high on Moscow's list. Iran's reported dissatisfaction likely comes from realizing that even their closest friends have their own calculations, their own red lines, and those lines don't always match Tehran's needs.
Okay, so beyond the direct U.S. role, we need to talk about Israel's own campaign. It was running in parallel, wasn't it? Their military actions against Iranian targets actually started more than a week before those big U.S. strikes.
That's right. It wasn't just a reaction from Israel. It seemed like a proactive, multi-pronged effort that was already underway.
So what was Israel hitting?
Well, their campaign was pretty expensive and quite deliberate. They kept up their systematic targeting of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC.
The IRGC, yeah.
And also Iranian internal security groups right inside Tehran. This included units whose job is defending territory, but also, importantly, suppressing internal dissent. We saw reports of strikes on specific IRGC provincial units in Karaj and Tehran.
So targeting the regime's muscle.
Precisely. They also hit the Law Enforcement Command's Information Security Command in Tehran, and even Evin Prison, which is infamous for holding political prisoners. This looks like it went beyond just stopping nukes. It seemed aimed at weakening the regime's grip on its own population.
And it wasn't just bombs and missiles. There were reports of intense psychological operations, too. The Washington Post story about Israeli intelligence calling senior Iranian leaders on their phones.
Yes, that was quite something.
Threatening them, their families, unless they turned against the regime. How effective can that kind of thing actually be against a regime like Iran's?
Well, a psychological ops like that, they're a fascinating tool, often underestimated. It's hard to measure the direct impact. Did official X immediately defect? Probably not. But the goal is clear. So paranoia, distrust, maybe drive wedges within the leadership.
Make them look over their shoulders.
Exactly. Target morale, loyalty. It might not cause an immediate collapse, but it can definitely feed into those internal fissures we were just talking about.
Yeah.
It makes the environment more tense, makes leaders question each other, maybe question their ultimate loyalty to Khamenei. It's a very personal, unsettling kind of warfare.
And this all seems to reflect Israel's broader objectives, doesn't it? Going beyond just the nuclear sites to actively trying to undermine the regime's stability, hitting economic targets, hitting the units that put down protests. Plus, that idea that Israel had almost total freedom of action in Iranian airspace. That's quite a statement. What does that tell us about Iran's air defenses or their priorities during this intense period?
It implies a pretty significant edge for Israel, operationally and maybe intelligence-wise. Total freedom of action, if accurate, suggests either, well, serious gaps in Iran's air defense network, or maybe a surprising unwillingness by Iran to engage Israeli aircraft, perhaps trying to conserve resources or avoid wider escalation.
A tough calculation for them either way.
For sure. But given the stakes involved, it's a stark indicator of a military imbalance and how exposed Iran's internal infrastructure apparently was to Israeli strikes, which for Israel directly relates back to their deep worries about Iran's overall military capabilities and ambitions.
And then Prime Minister Netanyahu comes out and says Israel was very, very close to hitting its goals, and they accepted the ceasefire after achieving their objectives, removing Tehran's nuclear and missile threat.
Right.
Sounds like mission accomplished from their side.
That statement is very telling, yeah. It suggests Israel felt they'd done enough damage, degraded Iran's capabilities sufficiently, at least for the moment, to justify pausing. For Israel, tackling the nuclear and missile threat is, well, existential.
Of course.
Now, whether those objectives are truly achieved permanently or just set back temporarily, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? Often, these kinds of military successes buy you time, maybe change the immediate calculation, but they don't always eliminate the underlying threat or the long-term ambition.
Right. It's really that simple.
Yeah.
But this whole situation, it wasn't just contained to the U.S., Iran, and Israel. It sent ripples out across the globe. How did other big players react, like Russia, China, Turkey?
Yeah, good question. Russia, for instance, was very cautious. Putin seems to see the whole conflict as fluid. He generally prefers keeping lines open to all sides, maybe hoping Moscow can eventually play mediator.
Okay.
Russia's main worry is still its global confrontation with the West. They definitely don't want a pro-Western Iran suddenly emerging, but they also likely fear a total regime collapse in Tehran that could create a vacuum, unpredictable outcomes right on their southern flank.
So they supplied drones but didn't jump in militarily.
Right. The strategic partnership doesn't seem to demand direct military intervention in this conflict. And let's be honest, Russia's own military capacity is pretty stretched thin by the war in Ukraine right now. So they're playing a careful diplomatic game. China, similarly, very cautious. Beijing called for restraint, diplomacy. They did condemn the U.S.-Israeli strikes, stressing sovereignty, but they're highly unlikely to get involved militarily. Their focus is more on diplomatic talk and protecting their own significant economic interests.
Energy and trade.
Absolutely. China has clear red lines. They do not want to see nuclear proliferation. And they definitely don't want any Iranian attack on their key Gulf partners, especially Saudi Arabia or the UAE. Too much energy, too much trade is at stake there. Any disruption to oil flows or regional stability hits China hard. And Turkey, well, as Iran's neighbor and a NATO member, they watched very closely. They offered to mediate and also, quite practically, raise concerns about potential hazardous radiation leaks from the nuclear sites, something that would directly affect them.
Makes sense. What about the energy markets? Usually you see big tension in the Middle East, oil prices spike. Did that happen this time?
Interestingly, no. Unlike a lot of previous crises in the region, this particular period didn't seem to seriously rattle the markets or threaten global supply chains.
Why not?
Well, the Strait of Hormuz, that critical shipping lane, stayed open. And crucially, the strikes seemed very specifically targeted. The U.S., and Israel too apparently, went after Iran's weapons program, the nuclear sites, the IRGC, the internal security stuff, not its conventional oil and gas infrastructure.
Ah, okay. A deliberate choice.
It appears so. It was a way to signal strength, address the nuclear concerns, but also show a degree of restraint by not hitting the infrastructure that would cause global economic chaos. A nuanced approach, really, which the markets seem to have understood.
So where does this leave us? We have this precarious balance, a de facto ceasefire, maybe, but it feels more like a tactical pause than any real resolution.
That's a good way to put it. Tactical pause.
What are the long-term scenarios for Iran now? How does this regime, under all this pressure from Israel and its allies, navigate what comes next?
That really is the crucial question, isn't it? And honestly, the Iran we see today is probably different from the Iran of 5 or 10 years ago. The pressures are immense. One possibility is what you might call strategic endurance. The regime kind of absorbs the losses, pulls back, regroups quietly, and maybe continues its nuclear program in a more hidden, decentralized way over the long haul.
Lying low and rebuilding.
Sort of. Another path could be shifting more towards asymmetric retaliation, using its proxy networks across the region, cyber attacks, covert operations, imposing costs on its adversaries from the shadows without direct attributable confrontation.
More deniable attacks.
Potentially. Or, and this is maybe the most profound possibility, could we be seeing the beginnings of a real internal transformation, maybe even a kind of slow-motion regime change, driven by those internal splits we talked about, combined with this relentless external pressure, Israel's constant vigilance, maybe popular discontent bubbling up?
That's a huge unknown.
It is. The future really isn't written yet. But for you, the listener, thinking about these potential paths, strategic endurance, asymmetric retaliation, or internal transformation is really important. Because Iran's trajectory, whichever way it goes, will absolutely shape the geopolitics of the entire Middle East and beyond for decades.
So this is it for today. The situation is rapidly evolving, and we will try to keep you updated. Please subscribe our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Our handle is 8digitalpes. See you in the next podcast. Keep listening.